Hello, and welcome back to our morality class. Today, we're going to continue our unit on the 6th and 9th commandments, especially violations against the 6th commandment. Last class, we talked about getting sex right and the common sense body language of what sex is and is supposed to be. What we're going to do today is use the ideas that we figured out in the last lesson and apply them to a couple examples and show how they just don't live up. This lesson is uncomfortable. It's material you're not used to hearing from teachers and from adults and from religious leaders, and it's language that I wouldn't normally use with minors. I'm going to try hard to be very polite, professional, appropriate in how I talk about certain concepts and actions. I'm going to trust that you're going to share that same discretion and politeness in speech when you ask questions about it. I have no intention of offending anyone or attacking anyone. It's not my goal. I'll work hard not to do that. And if I do say something controversial or hurtful to you, I apologize. Please tell me so in the live stream or a discussion after, and we can figure out what went wrong. I'm going to try hard to be very clear on this topic, and I appreciate your patience and your goodwill as I tackle a very difficult issue. Let's get into it. So, in our last class, we talked about the body language of sex and what it says. And what we found it says is, I love you so much that I want the world to have more of you in it, and I'm willing to put in the rest of my life to do that responsibly, to make and raise those children. It's a very common sense, very obvious way of thinking about sex. It's a way many of you said you hadn't heard or thought of before. And we looked at how a quick look at biology and a quick look at theology both bear out that very base level, simple body language speech. Today we're going to add some terminology to that. There are two aspects of the act of sexual intercourse that are both covered by that body language summary we gave. They are the procreative and unitive aspects. Procreative, unitive. Those are words we're going to keep coming back to. Procreative means participating in God's act of creation. God makes humanity. He makes the man and the woman, right? When we conceive another human being in the act of sexual intercourse, we're participating, in a certain sense, in being like God, in creating a new life. We contribute genes and bodies, and God contributes in that same act, in that same moment, a soul. Procreate. We participate in God's creation of new life. There's a beauty there. The procreative aspect of the sexual act means that the act of sex is open to conception. It doesn't mean you have to succeed in actually conceiving every time. That's beyond your control. But it does mean it's an act that reasonably will result in conceiving a child. Procreative. The second aspect is unitive, and this is also important. Unitive meaning uniting, bringing two people together. That presupposes that there's two people who are capable of uniting, and that they're willing to unite for the appropriate term, length of time, and it's there to help them. This is that psychological and emotional bonding we talked about that comes as a result of people having sex. The fact that they are closer together as a result. The strengthening and deepening of that relationship. Both aspects, procreative, unitive, must be present in every act of sex. That's Catholic morality on sex, summed up in the densest, simplest possible way. Every single sexual act must respect both the natural procreative aspect and the natural unitive aspect. 1-2 criteria. Which means you really don't need me to teach this lesson. You could just think through, well, anything you're curious about and say, does it respect both of those two things? If the answer isn't yes to both of them, don't do it. But I'm going to help you unpack those things a little bit anyway, just to get some clarity on how they work. But that's the idea here. Every sexual act must respect both the procreative, potentially reproductive, and unitive, relationship strengthening, mutual loving aspect of the couple's relationship. Let's look at some examples of actions that don't respect those two things. That'll help us clarify what we mean by these two things and show you why Jesus and Holy Mother Church have traditionally taught that certain things are just wrong. Let's look into it. The first and most obvious case we're going to talk about is the act of adultery. Adultery, the act specifically and explicitly condemned by the Sixth Commandment, is sex by a married person, not with the person they're married to. You got a husband and a wife, and some other person over here who's having sex with one of them. That's adultery. It should be immediately obvious how this violates, in a drastic way, the unitive aspect of sex. It doesn't unite the couple in their relationship. It actually divides them. There's a betrayal. There's a violation of vows. There's a question of loyalty. Are they going to leave me for this other person with whom they're now giving something that they're only supposed to give to me? It's a grave violation against the unity that's supposed to go with family. And please note, the act of adultery is not just a crime against your spouse or against the spouse of the person with whom you committed. It's against the whole family. And not just this family and that family, but family in general at a societal level. Let me show you what I mean. First of all, it's a crime against the families of the spouses involved. The life and health of the children in a family are based on the strength of the marriage of their parents. That's where they came from. That's how they're provided for. That's how they're protected, raised, nourished, shown how to grow up to be a good man or a good woman, etc. It's all dependent on the strength of that original marriage. The act of adultery throws all of that into confusion, question, even doubt whether or not it will sustain. And it does that to families on both sides of this act. That's bad, that's disruptive, that's harmful, and just relationship wrenching on both sides. But also notice there's a social dimension to this besides this family and that family. There's also the idea that in a society that makes this okay, all families are unstable. If adultery is no big deal, how can a wife trust her husband? If adultery is just okay and a kosher, no big deal, everyone does it, etc., how can a husband trust his wife? How can spouses commit their entire life savings, future goal, house, resources into one family project? You'd be building on sand instead of building on solid rock. Therefore, not only is there an obligation of individuals not to adulterate marriages, but also of society to protect the family. Like we talked about in our unit on the Fourth Commandment and how the role of society is to protect families, adultery is one of the first things it needs to be protected from. Society needs to have rules against, protections against, disincentives to adultery in order to protect families, because otherwise marriages are unstable and children suffer. Adultery. Most obvious case of a violation of the unitive aspect of the sexual act. The next similar act we're going to look at is fornication. To fornicate is to have sex before the marriage vow is contracted. Presumably, usually, with the person to whom you intend to marry, right? You're going to get married anyway, so what's the big deal? Tends to be the cultural attitude towards this act. There is a big deal there. And it looks like this. The two main reasons or the two main circumstances under which a seriously committed romantic couple are going to fornicate are, one, they don't care or don't want to bother waiting, or they really want to wait and do it right, but they're just not in control of themselves to wait. Either one of those is a problem, and it's a marriage problem. See, in the first case, they've divorced sex from marriage. Well, sex is this thing you do that's fun, and marriage is that serious thing you do over there maybe later. that attitude just doesn't work with how we've understood the act of sex. It doesn't respect the procreative and unitive aspects are supposed to go together. It takes something beautiful, important, holy, serious, and potentially life-giving and treats it as mere recreation instead of as procreation. That's a problem. And it doesn't respect that that's supposed to form a permanent bond. If you're still just dating someone, there's a real chance you're going to break up. If you weren't, you'd be married, right? That's the idea. And likewise, even with engagements, they get broken off. They're made to be broken off, whereas marriages are made and designed to be permanent. So much for the couple who just doesn't care to wait. For the couple who's not in control to wait, that should be a red flag of whether or not you should get married at all in the first place. It's not like once you get married, suddenly you get to have sex all the time, nonstop, with no need for self-control. Self-control is still an important discipline. It's still part of how you respect yourself and your spouse and your bodies. If you are incapable of the chastity necessary to not have sex before you're married, that should raise serious spiritual concerns about whether or not you're mature enough to be married. There's good cause to hesitate there too. Now, obviously, this isn't as disruptive to the whole social order as adultery is. It's not quite the same as saying it's not a big deal. It does still matter. So much for fornication as a watering down of the unitive effect and the lack of respect for the unitive effect of the sexual act. The next act we need to look at is not a violation of the unitive aspect of sex like the last two. It's a violation of the procreative aspect of sex. Generally, we'll call it contraception, and it's any one or series of actions that's deliberately designed to stop the body from doing what it's naturally supposed to do in the context of sex, which is conceive. This can take the form of a physical barrier being placed between the bodies of the man and the woman, or of a chemical barrier, usually taken by the woman, but not necessarily, or even a surgical barrier where, necessary parts of the operation are removed from the working order. This is as much detail as we need on that topic. But I want to show you what's wrong there. What's wrong with contraceptive sex? First of all, take a look at the word contraceptive. Against conception. It's literally an anti-life position. Not in the sense of anti-life of, homicidal, trying to kill, but it is saying there's the possibility for new life here, but we don't want it. More humans, more people, cute little babies? Nuh-uh, keep them away from me. That's not what most people mean or think they're saying when they put themselves in this position. But to be fair, that is what's implied by the act. That's what they're doing. Contraceptive sex is immoral in the same ways that, say, fornication and adultery are immoral. And here's why. They make a lie out of body language. They take the truth of what it is someone is doing when they have sex. Think back to what we said that act means. I love you so much. I want there to be more of you in the world. I want to make more yous, right? That's no longer true in contraceptive sex. Hey, I want to have fun with you, but only for now and not with any real commitment. Hey, I want to feel really good and really close with you, but I also want to keep in my back pocket the option to just break up and walk away without any consequences or commitments. The raising of children is part of what a couple does, part of what keeps them married. It becomes their mission for the next 20, 30, whatever it is, years over having children. Having this contraceptive sex, even in the context of a married couple, fails to respect the full beauty of this act. If sex, done right, is giving another person your whole life, past, present, and future, contraceptive sex is pretending to do that while only giving them the present. Hey, I love you, but not that much. I love everything about you, but not your fertility. Oh, that's weird. Keep it away from me. I love everything about you, except that one part that might be really inconvenient for me. keep that away from me, and then everything's fine. There's a distance there. There's a gap. It's a barrier. It's literally trying to forge a relationship with someone. It is typically unitive, right? While also building a wall between you and them. There's a problem there. It's missing something. It's not doing everything it's supposed to do. And it's worth pointing out that these are extra measures, chemical or physical, that are forced on the body to trick it, right? To not let it do what it's supposed to do. Yeah. That's what most people mean by playing it safe, or other slang for contraceptives. But you're not playing it safe. You're deceiving your body into not doing what it thinks it's doing. You're lying to someone with body language. You're withholding part of yourself when you should be making a full gift of yourself. So much for contraceptive sex. The next act, or in this case, group of acts that we need to address, are what might be called, I don't know, something like alternative sexual acts. Strictly speaking, these are not sex. They go by names, and I think those names are dishonest. I think those names are a lie. But our culture, since the 1960s, calls them things like anal sex or oral sex. Not really. They're abuses against sex or perversions of sex. They're getting sex really wrong. And I'll show you why. All of those acts are going to violate not just the procreative, but also the unitive aspects of sex. First, the procreative aspects. There's a problem there. Obviously, those acts are incapable of resulting in new life. The whole point of sex, what it's evolved, designed to do, has been stripped away from it. Instead of chemically here, by anatomical abuse, if you will. It's not what you're made for. It doesn't work. And it's worth pointing out that not only is it not possible to conceive by performing these acts, which is why unmarried people in particular tend to, find that as a redeeming quality because they're terrified of becoming parents. If you're not ready to be a parent, you're not ready to have sex. But it's not just about the loss of the procreative act. It's the fact that these acts really do constitute a form of abuse. They're damaging. There's a reason that they come with higher risk of health complications and STDs. They're dangerous. It's not what your body's made for. You're trying to abuse it into doing something it was never evolved or designed to do. That's not how it's supposed to work. You've lost the sense that they're an act of love. If sex done right says, I love you so much, I want to give the rest of my life to filling the world with little yous, and contraceptive sex says something like, I love you so much that I want to spend a certain amount of time close with you, but not to make more of you. Really easy there. These acts say something like, I want to feel good now at your expense. In a way that's not helpful to you. And that's where we run into a problem with the unitive act. There's a loss of love here. Is it ever an act of love to put the other person in a position that biologically they're not made to be in, with a higher risk of damage, disease, etc.? Is that ever an act of love, by our definition of love, to will the good of the other? I'm firmly convinced that no, it's not. That's not what love looks like. That's not what love feels like. Those tend to be acts of manipulation or mutual use and abuse. But that's not love. It doesn't work. This is probably the time to address, by the way, the biggest misconception in the whole context of Christian sexual morality, which is that Christianity or the church forbids gay sex or gay marriage, or is opposed to homosexuality, or is wrong for being heteronormative, various political such terms of this way of thinking about it. they're all completely incorrect because they're thinking about it in the wrong terms from the first place. At no point does Holy Mother Church say, straight people get to have sex, gay people don't, or anything even remotely like that. And you have to be so wildly off base of who the church is and what she does and doesn't say, or who Jesus is and what he does and doesn't say, to think that's even the issue. What is condemned are specific acts. Some actions are okay, other actions are not. It has nothing to do with the actor and everything to do with the moral object. In terms of sexual activity, procreative unitive sexual intercourse is the only morally acceptable use of the sexual capacity of the body. Anything else isn't good enough. It doesn't give that act and that person the respect and love that they demand. It's got nothing to do with who's who or what's what. Some acts are okay, other acts are not. Every human being deserves love and respect. That's the church's position, always has been. Why? Because that's Jesus' position. Some acts are acts of love, they are good. Other acts are not acts of love, they are not good because they fail to be acts of love. And everyone is held to the same standard. One other act that needs to be addressed in the context of this lesson is another one that violates both the procreative and the unitive aspects of sexuality. This is masturbation. Traditionally in Catholic theology, it's called the solitary sin, or the sin of self-abuse. And that prefix sola in solitary, soul, single, alone, and that word self tells everything we need to know about this act. It's done alone. There are two massive problems here. And one is that it can never be procreative. If sex is supposed to give new life, what this does is sort of totally circumvent that in the most complete way possible, right? It's utterly non-life-giving. But more important and more overlooked is the fact that it's utterly non-unitive. There is no other person with whom to unite yourself. It's alone. And your body and your soul are trying to perform an action that is made to bond you to another person in a physical and mental and emotional and psychological and, yes, spiritual way. And there's no other person there to whom you're being bound. It's a function of loneliness. And it's not good, God says, for the man to be alone. It's not what you're made for. Doesn't work. It's not right. It's very clearly, very obviously not what sex is for. And there's a particular danger in this particular abuse of sexuality that it's habit forming, more so than any of the other acts we've talked about, in a way that can make it very difficult to function normally in a healthy relationship later. It has long-term consequences that damage the unitive aspect of the act later, even over and above the fact that it fails to be unitive in its own right, and instead is a function of loneliness, solitariness, self-abuse. Sex is made to bind you to another person through your bodies and your souls, and eventually through another person. This particular act avoids all of that, and is therefore empty, lonely, unsatisfying. One last point needs to be made about all of these acts that I think it's totally overlooked in popular, conventional, secular discourse about them. All of these acts are immoral. Please remember what that means. It doesn't mean you're a bad person if you do them. Christians often get stereotyped as a sort of finger-wagging judgmentalism. That's not what we said. That's not what Christ said. That's not what we believe. It does not mean you're going to go to hell if you perform them. Again, that's not what we said. That's not what Christ said. What's morality? It's the study of human happiness. Here's the church's positions on these acts. Here is Jesus's position on these various acts. They will not make you happy. They will not make you happy. In various ways, they violate right relationship between your body and soul and another person's body and soul. They're sins. And they do the same thing that any other sin does. They alienate you from God and you from another person. They damage and ultimately weaken relationships rather than fulfilling them. Remember, without sin, the man and woman are naked in the garden without shame, in perfect mutual love. With sin, they're hiding, lying, blaming, alienating, fighting. From God as well as from one another. That's the church's position on these things. When people start trying to make political points about these things, the discourse gets very ugly. People start coming down into these stupid, narrow-minded categories of pro or anti. They even try to talk about these things as rights. I don't know who in their right mind thinks the category of human rights applies to performing optional, non-obligatory, non-necessary sex acts. But I'd be very impressed if anyone can come up with a rational proof of that. Hint, they can't. I've studied the politics and the philosophy. I don't think it works. That's not what this is about. It's about happiness. The reason the church, the reason Christ says, don't do these things, isn't a power trip, isn't about control, isn't about bossing people around. It's not about oppression. It's about love. None of these things will make you deeply and abidingly happy. None of them will give you the relationships, the fullness of relationships for which you are made. I promise. They will not do that for you. That's why you avoid them. Out of love for yourself, out of love for your neighbor, out of love for God. Saying no to those acts is a function of morality, a function of cultivating virtue, self-discipline, for the sake of being able to be responsible, mature, self-disciplined, so you can love. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to talk about cultivating the self-discipline that goes with chastity and how it's an act of charity. We're going to talk about lust and chastity and what happens in your mind and your soul and how to get there. We'll do all that. But for now, don't miss the point. The whole point of this whole topic, this whole commandment, all the commandments, is to result in human happiness. And it's only in our culture, which is so obsessed with sex and politics and making sex a function of politics of all things, that I have to remind people we're talking about happiness. When I talked about not divorcing people or not killing people, you guys kind of got the hint. Why those things don't make people in society happy. That's true here too. And I'm going to argue that that's the biggest lie our culture believes and is trying to foist upon you and I unbeknown. It's trying to fool you. It's lying to you when it says sex without consequences feel good, or everyone should be able to have whatever sex they want. That's a right. No, those are lies, and those lies will not make you happy. Sorry. Quick review of what we covered today. We recapped last lesson where we looked at what the truth of sex, the true body language of sex looks like. And we looked at a variety of actions that get that wrong. We looked at actions that fail to respect the unitive act of sex, bringing two people together in the permanent bond of marriage. And we looked at acts that fail to live up to the procreative aspect, the fact that this act is so joyful it should bring new life into the world. And we looked at acts that fail both tests. And most importantly, we got the big reminder. The reason we say no to these things is because they don't actually result in happiness. It's a big temptation, like the serpent in the garden whispers, to think that they will. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I really do look forward to your questions, your comments, your responses in the live stream today. I hope, I pray, I didn't say anything too controversial or offensive or hurtful. It's not my intention. If I did, I want to hear from you, and I apologize. Thank you guys so much. God bless.